この世に生まれて名乗っただけで死ぬ人間がいてたまるか。
D の一族をこう呼ぶ者たちもいる。神の天敵。
クラウディ・クローバー、
トラファルガー D、ワーテルロ、
ロックス D ジーベック。
ネフェルタリ、D リリー、
俺はモンキー D ルビー。
モンキー D ドラゴン、
モンキー D カブ。
ゴール D エース。
ゴール D ロジャーだ。
ポートガス D ルージュ、
ハグワール D サウロだ。
マーシャル D ティーチ、伝えてくれ。
我々も D であると。 D はいつも数奇な運命に満ちて。
わしは必ず解いてみせるぞ。過去から声が聞こえてくるんじゃ。
The Will of D. Where do I start? Imu told King Cobra the truth directly, without ambiguity. D is the name of those who once opposed us. Not a prophecy, a name, carried by the enemies of the world government's founders, from a conflict that predates even the Void Century, passed down through descendants who mostly have no idea what they're carrying. Imu calls the living bearers empty husks, ignorant of the meaning of their name. That line is the whole tragedy and the whole thesis at once. The D is not a chosen destiny that its carriers walk toward with full knowledge. It's an inheritance most of them never asked for and never understood. And yet every single confirmed bearer, without exception, has still lived out the same basic pattern. They oppose the established order, directly or by consequence. They caused changes too large to undo, and when death came for them, they were not afraid of it. The language Imu uses, those who once opposed us, sits in an interesting, unintentional conversion with a very old piece of real-world scripture. Ephesians 2:1-3. If you don't know what that is, it is a passage in the New Testament of the Bible. I find this really interesting because when I was going through this scripture, the parallels I drew between the gods and the Ds in One Piece was profound. In the scripture, it describes people living apart from God as children of disobedience, or the children of the D, people who walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and who were by nature the children of wrath, even as others. That passage isn't about One Piece obviously, and I'm not claiming Oda had it in mind, but the framing it uses, a ruling power that defines certain people as inherently disobedient, inherently opposed to the established order, simply by what they are rather than anything they've chosen, is a strikingly precise real-world mirror for how Imu talks about the D. And it's a mirror that cuts in an unexpected direction once you ask the obvious follow-up question, what if the power doing the naming isn't actually God at all? The Will of D isn't a supernatural power, it's a signature. And with this video, I'm going to overanalyze that signature, roughly a dozen times over, across 800 years, and let the pattern speak for itself. I want to start with a piece of language that has nothing to do with One Piece, and then show you why it will not leave this story alone once you have heard it. And also a disclaimer first, these are parallels that I have drawn myself. Nothing here is confirmed, nor am I claiming Oda is adapting Ephesian. The scripture is a lens I am holding up to the story. Its only job is to make the world government's own vocabulary legible, because that vocabulary is unmistakably theological, and it did not invent itself either. From the Epistle to the Ephesians, the King James Version, chapter 2 verse 2, quote, "Wherein in time past ye walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience." Now here is what the phrase does. In Ephesians, the children of disobedience are not rebels to be admired. They are the condemned. They walk according to the course of this world. They follow worldly appetite instead of divine order. Crucially, the disobedience is described as something worked in them, a disposition they carry rather than a position they argued their way into, and the wrath of God is coming for them. Really does sound like inherited will here, doesn't it? Now put that next to what Don Quixote Rocinante tells a dying child in chapter 764. He tells Law that the D is a hidden name, passed down through history, and that in some parts of the world, its carriers are called the natural enemies of God, meaning the celestial dragons, the people who actually accept worship in this world. So the world government's charge sheet against the D is functionally Ephesians chapter 2 verse 2. Quote, "Here is a family that walks contrary to the divine order, that does not choose its rebellion but is born into it, generation after generation, and upon whom wrath is coming, and the charge fits." That is the uncomfortable part. Read the confirmed record of the D bearers, and the accusation is basically accurate as description. They do oppose the established order. They do it across 8 centuries, across every faction, without coordinating. The government is not lying about the pattern. It is lying about one thing and one thing only. Ephesians can call disobedience a sin because the authority being disobeyed is real. But what if you were to remove the real God from that verse? It ends up not surviving as a condemnation. It becomes something else entirely. And that thing is a description of people who decline to obey a fraud, written down by the fraud, and archived for 800 years as though it were law. So, before I even talk about any Ds in this video, I need to establish one thing first. Not who the D are, but what they are supposedly guilty against. One Piece has been running the same experiment on divinity since Skypiea, and it has never once produced a different result. One Piece is basically decorated with the ladder of false gods. So let's start at the very beginning. Skypiea, a man eats a logia fruit, acquires a bell, invents a mythology, staffs a heaven with priests, runs ordeals as divine judgment, and holds an entire sky nation in religious terror for 6 years. Every structural feature of a god is present: the worship, the omniscience. He could hear the whole island, the arbitrary judgment, the promised paradise, and he loses to a boy made of rubber. I think Skypiea is Oda's thesis statement on divinity, planted hundreds of chapters before the story needed it, and the detail that matters most is how Enel loses. Not to a miracle, not to a more powerful god, to a physical immunity. Luffy's body simply does not conduct what Enel is. Enel's godhood was never metaphysics. It was a matchup he happened to be winning locally, until someone arrived who was outside the matchup. A god is a man whose power exceeds the local capacity to verify him. And the moment verification becomes possible, the god becomes a man with a bad matchup and a very expensive drum set. The divine gods of the world of One Piece are the celestial dragons, the descendants of the 20 kings who founded the world government, and they are worshipped by decree. They wear bubbles on their heads because they refuse to breathe the same air as the people below them. They own slaves. They shoot commoners for standing in the wrong place. Nothing about their status is earned, tested, or renewable. It is a hereditary license, and its only qualification is descent. This is where Ephesians chapter 5 verse 6 starts to bite. Quote, "Worship pointed at something that cannot deserve it, propped up by vain words." The celestial dragons exist to be worshipped. They punish the failure to worship, and across roughly 1100 chapters, they have produced nothing whatsoever that would justify the worship. Their divinity is entirely an artifact of who is required to bow. The 5 elders. The Gorosei are not administrators in robes. Each is called a warrior god. Each holds a mythical Zoan transformation, and none of them can be killed by conventional means. That last part is genuinely frightening, and it is also the tell. Because look at the texture of it. They bleed. They scream. That is the fighting style of something that has spent centuries never having to find out whether it could actually lose. Unkillable so far is not invulnerable. And I would argue the entire endgame of this series turns on the gap between those two words. Now last but not least, the highest counterfeit, Imu. Imu sits above the 5 elders, who kneel. Imu occupies the empty throne, the seat the world's monarchs were told must stay empty forever. Imu commands a weapon that erased the kingdom of Lulusia from the map. Imu killed King Cobra personally. Imu reacts to the names D and Joy Boy as existential threats. Imu tracks the D bloodline institutionally, across centuries, as something he's genuinely worried about. A god does not need a chair. A throne is not a source of power. It is a claim made to an audience, and its whole function is to be looked at. Imu's throne is in a room nobody is permitted to enter, which means Imu built a symbol of legitimacy and then hid it. The behavior of something that needs the idea of authority more than it possesses the thing itself. Then the erasure. Omnipotence has no use for censorship. If you genuinely made the world, the record of how you made it is not a liability. The Void Century is 100 years of deleted history, guarded by a standing death penalty on the study of poneglyphs. And every year that program continues is another year of confession. There is a version of events that would cost this institution its position, and it is still out there in stone. Then the surveillance. Imu, the 5 elders, and the celestial dragons maintain what amounts to a watch list for a single letter of the alphabet. And an entity that requires 8 centuries of intelligence work to locate roughly a dozen people is not omniscient. It is understaffed. Everything Imu has done for 800 years. The deletion, the monitoring, the extermination of the Davy family. The personal execution of a man who merely asked a question. Imu is not a god. Imu is the longest reigning tyrant in this story. And the only reason we struggle to tell those apart is that Imu has had 800 years and total editorial control of the archive to make them look identical. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 2 literally verbalized this. What sits on that throne is not God. It is the prince of the power of the air, a hidden thing that rules the course of this world, whose authority is universally assumed and has never once been verified by anyone still alive to report on it. If the god is counterfeit, the crime is counterfeit. Natural enemy of God is not a description of the D clan. It is a charge sheet written by the defendant, in a language the defendant invented. The children of disobedience were only ever disobedient to a fraud, and everything Corazon told Law in chapter 764 is true, except the single most important noun in the sentence. Before we bring up any single bearer, let's lay the foundation cleanly of everything we know so far, because everything after this rests on it. The actual first mention of the D in the series was in Drum Island. Dr. Kureha tells Dalton that the Pirate King's real name was Gol D. Roger, but Kureha doesn't stop at the correction. In the same scene, after seeing Luffy's wanted poster brought in by Ace, she remarks with a knowing look that her former student Chopper has gone off with an extraordinarily dangerous man, and adds that the will of D lives on. That's the first time in the series anyone frames the D as something ongoing and alive in the present, rather than a historical curiosity attached to a dead pirate king. And it's Luffy the line is pointed at, years before the story gives any other reason to think of him that way. Oda plants the initial so quietly that it takes the story hundreds of chapters to even suggest it matters, because I myself just brushed over it when I was first introduced to One Piece, which in retrospect is exactly the point. The D doesn't announce itself. It just sits there in people's names, waiting for someone to notice. The story picks the thread back up almost immediately after, in Alabasta, though quote-unquote picks up really undersells how little anyone actually knows at this stage. Robin turns to Luffy and asks him directly what the D means and why the people who carry it fight the way they do. And Luffy, without a trace of the significance the question deserves, has no idea. This is the first on-page confirmation of something this video will keep circling back to. Carrying the name and understanding it are two completely separate experiences, and most bearers only ever get the first one. Skypia gives the pattern its first outside witness. Ganfall tells Robin that Luffy leaves him with the exact same impression Roger once did, and refuses to write off the shared D between them as coincidence, the pattern being noticed from the outside, by someone with nothing to gain from noticing it. The Ohara flashback complicates the picture in the opposite direction. Saul tells young Robin plainly that he doesn't know what the D means either, only that everyone in his own clan carries it. Chapter 507 at Sabaody and Marineford is where the story starts connecting these threads into something resembling an actual historical claim. Robin links the will of D explicitly to the Void Century, and Rayleigh confirms that he and the rest of the Roger pirates learned everything there was to know about it by the time they reached Laugh Tale. Full knowledge of that mystery is something a person can actually reach during their lifetime, not a truth locked away permanently. Then in Marineford, Whitebeard reinforces the very claim that's been lurking in the shadows for the past 400 chapters. Whitebeard dying makes a declaration that becomes the backbone of the actual will of D. Killing someone who carries the D does not extinguish the flame. Someone else will inherit that will, and carry Roger's wish forward regardless. And in the flashback, the story eventually shows, Roger is asked outright by Whitebeard what the D actually is, and Roger appears to answer him. Now post Marineford, Law picks up a version of the same uncertainty, wondering aloud whether the will of D will call up a storm again, and invoking it a second time when Doflamingo asks him why he's chosen to believe in someone like Luffy, because we already know exactly where that phrase came from. Chapter 764 delivers its first real foundational fact in the Dressrosa flashback. Corazon sits young Law down and tells him that the D has been secretly inherited by families all over the world, that the clan carrying it has historically been called the natural enemy of God, and that in some places, parents tell their children they'll be eaten by D. Corazon isn't delivering a lecture on cosmic law. He's warning a child, plainly and urgently, that the name attached to him is dangerous, years before either of them has any idea how directly that warning applies. That confusion doesn't resolve cleanly even when Law finally confronts someone who should know more. Law tells Sengoku outright that he's a D, and asks him directly what he knows about it. Sengoku's answer is more specific. Corazon didn't protect Law because he carried the D, Sengoku says. He protected him because he loved him, and Law shouldn't attach some grander destiny-shaped reason to affection that was simply real. When Law pushes further, Sengoku admits he can't say either way whether he knows anything about the initial itself. The institutional paranoia around the name becomes even more explicit once the story reaches Wano and Egghead. After Luffy's Nika awakening, the five elders order the D struck from his new wanted poster entirely. It fails, and the D spreads anyway. Vegapunk's final broadcast addresses the clan of D directly, telling the world that among them there is A, before being cut off. One more unfinished sentence, in a mystery built almost entirely out of moments where someone is about to say the thing, and doesn't get to. Then chapter 1085 arrives and finally gives us something with real edges. Imu tells Cobra that D was the name of an ancient enemy of the First 20, the founding powers behind the world government, now surviving only as a faint echo. In the same conversation, Nefertari Lily centuries dead was revealed as a D-bearer, and this all goes deeper in Elbaf. Imu concedes to Rox D. Zebek the legitimacy of the Davy family's grievance over Davy D. Jones. Rox believes Jones's will passes towards some unfulfilled promise, and Imu equating the entire nation of Elbaf with the D, after King Harold's defiance. Running underneath all of this is a pattern the text has never stated as a rule, but keeps returning to. Roger, Ace, and Cobra all died smiling or at peace. Nobody has ever said this is how it works. It's simply, consistently, how it keeps happening. But the interesting thing here is, the Davy family gives the broader pattern a specific shape, an ancient lineage tracing to Davy D. Jones, distinct enough that Rox D. Zebek hid his true name to escape its particular persecution, with Marshall D. Teach as the last known survivor after God Valley. Put the whole roster together and the count comes to 16 named carriers. The Monkey family, Luffy, Dragon, and Garp, Roger's line Roger, Rouge, and Ace, the Nefertari line Lily, Cobra, Vivi, the Clue family Clover and his executed older brother, the Davy line Jones, Rox, Teach, and outside any family line, Jaguar D. Saul and Trafalgar D. Law. Now before we go any further, I need to talk about all the bearers individually. Who else to start off with other than the king himself? Goldie Roger, the one who knew. Roger is the only confirmed bearer who learned the true meaning of the D during his voyage to Laugh-Tale, and everything he did afterward reads differently once that fact is on the table. He triggered the entire age of pirates by revealing the location of his treasure at his own public execution, then died laughing, entirely on his own terms. Roger's laugh at the scaffold is arguably the single most devastating act of disobedience in the whole series, due to the fact that he was executed as a heretic by an authority he had personally, completely verified was fraudulent, and he found that funny. Porgas D. Rouge, the one who refused to let them win. Rouge carried her pregnancy for 20 months through sheer will, purely to deny the world government the execution of Roger's unborn child, and died shortly after giving birth. This is one of the purest expressions of the pattern in the entire catalog. Opposition expressed as pure endurance, at total personal cost, existing only to ensure the next generation survived regardless of what happened to her. The disobedience here is totally biological, silent, and absolute. Portgas D. Ace, the one who died smiling, raised by Garp, brother to Luffy and Sabo. Ace died at Marineford protecting Luffy, smiling and at peace, having spent his entire life trying to prove he deserved to exist at all. This is the clearest, most emotionally direct confirmation of the pattern anywhere in the story. A boy who spent his whole life afraid he was a mistake, dying without a trace of the fear that should, by every rule the world government has written, belong to him. Now, let's get into the Monkey family. Luffy is the current, most consequential active bearer, and I don't need to even say much here, since I'm guessing we're all already aware of that. The pattern is visible mechanically, in the change he leaves behind at literally every single island he goes to, in Whitebeard's dying declaration about the age about to begin, and in a habit of smiling through danger that is simply native to how he's written. Luffy is the only major character in the entire story who has never, at any point, acknowledged an authority above himself as legitimate. Whether that be a king, a celestial dragon, or even heaven itself. It doesn't fucking matter. He has simply never registered that there was one to rebel against. Monkey D. Garp. Garp is the catalog's most interesting complication, a bearer who spent decades inside the institution most opposed to his own name, and used that position quietly, repeatedly, to protect other bearers instead. This is opposition as sabotage from within rather than open rebellion, and it argues something sharper than any pirate story could. Put a D inside Heaven's own army for 50 years, and it still refuses at every decisive moment. Monkey D. Dragon, leader of the Revolutionary Army and the world's most wanted man. Dragon renders the D's opposition into deliberate, structural, political form rather than personal consequence. Where Roger triggered chaos and Luffy causes it as a byproduct of simply existing, Dragon built an organization around it. Proof that the pattern of disobedience doesn't require piracy at all, only opposition to the world's current order, in whatever shape a life makes available. One detail worth touching on is that the Revolutionary Army's declared enemy is not a nation or a navy. It is the Celestial Dragon specifically. The only organized political movement in this world is aimed directly at the gods. Now the Nefertari family. Nefertari D. Lily, the ancient ancestor, confirmed by Imu directly to Cobra as a bearer. Lily was queen of Alabasta centuries before the present story, and abandoned her royal position to ensure the poneglyphs, the stone record of the Void Century, were scattered across the world at the cost of her own life. She is proof the pattern is genuinely ancient, and proof that for a D, opposing the order has historically meant protecting truth as often as fighting battles, which directly ties into Ephesians chapter 5 verse 6. Let no man deceive you with vain words. Lily's entire life's work was making sure the vain words could always, eventually, be checked against stone. Nefertari Cobra, the one who paid the most recent price. King of Alabasta and Vivi's father, Cobra was killed personally by Imu after learning and attempting to reveal the truth about Lily and the Void Century. This is the story's most direct, real-time demonstration of the pattern completing. A bearer learns something the government cannot allow to spread, dies for it, and hands the responsibility onward, which in this case was Sabo, with instructions to reach Luffy and Vivi, rather than letting the knowledge die with him. Nefertari Vivi, the one still carrying it forward. Princess of Alabasta, Vivi is confirmed through Cobra's final revelation of Lily's full name, and Imu's own framing of the Nefertari bloodline, to be a living bearer of the D, though she is not confirmed to have been previously aware of it herself. She is the only confirmed living bearer who is neither pirate, marine, nor revolutionary in any combat sense, and the pattern in her case manifests through diplomacy, information, and quiet resistance rather than confrontation. Jaguar D. Saul, the giant who chose a child over his orders. A former Marine Vice Admiral, Saul defected after choosing to protect a young Nico Robin from a Buster Call, ordered to erase Ohara's entire population. He died, or appeared to, trying to save her, laughing as he was frozen, telling Robin the world she wanted to know about would find her. Saul disobeyed a direct order from the institution that dresses itself in heaven's language, to spare the life of a child, and the story treats that disobedience as the single most morally clarifying act in the entire Ohara flashback. Rox D. Zebek, the one who went straight at the source. Born Davy D. Zebek, Rox was the most dangerous pirate of his generation. A descendant of a figure named Davy D. Jones who confronted Imu directly during the God Valley incident, referencing both Davy Jones and Joy Boy before being succumbed to Domi Reversi and killed. This is the clearest confirmed case of a bearer challenging the seat of power at its literal source rather than through indirect resistance, and dying for exactly that act. And the interesting thing is that Rox did not ask Imu who ruled the world. He asked what it was afraid of. A question only asked of something you have already decided isn't a god. Marshall D. Teach, the one who perverts the pattern. Blackbeard, a Yonko, and the last known survivor of the Davy family bloodline after God Valley. Same initial, same bloodline level opposition to the established order. And yet, his stated goal, in his own words, is the world, which reads as domination, rather than liberation. Whitebeard is on record, dismissing any claim Teach might make to carrying Roger's will in the fuller sense. Now this is where things kinda get obscure because Teach is the only one who perverts from the pattern of D. I'll be going deeper into this later. But Blackbeard is the story's own question about whether the D's pattern has ever actually been about freedom, or simply about not being the one who obeys. Trafalgar D. Waterlaw, a former warlord and captain of the Heart Pirates. Law is the direct recipient of our first confirmed information about the D, delivered by Corazon, and yet spent years unaware of the deeper implication, consumed entirely by his own grief and his plan for revenge. Remember Imu calling the D empty husks? Well, Law is or was the clearest embodiment of that. Not because he lacks depth, but because his early arc plays out with zero awareness that his own name marks him as something the world's oldest power has watched for centuries. If Ephesians describes a rebellion worked into a person rather than chosen by them, Law is the case study. A man carrying a hereditary charge of heresy against a god he had never even heard of. Cludy Clover, the scholar who paid for the truth. Head of the Ohara archaeologists, Clover was executed in the Buster Call that destroyed his island for the crime of researching the Void Century. He fits the pattern at the level of consequence. Punished by the establishment for pursuing forbidden truth, Clover was silenced by cannon fire mid-sentence. At the exact moment he was about to name the ancient kingdom out loud, the wrath of a supposed god arrived precisely on schedule to interrupt the sentence. The pattern in all of this is all pretty simple. They oppose the established order in every available form. Every bearer above is directly responsible for some event the world could not absorb and return to normal from. The start of the Age of Pirates, the scattering of the Poneglyphs, the exposure of a Buster Call atrocity, the unraveling of Wano and Dressrosa. This is the pattern's most testable claim. D-bearers don't merely live interesting lives, they leave the world measurably different, in ways the institution cannot fully undo, and the theological consequence follows naturally. So an authority that were actually divine would be able to put things back. But this one can only delete islands, and hope nobody was writing anything down. So what is completely confirmed here is that the D is not a bloodline with powers, nor is it a prophecy of any sort. It is a name, an affiliation marker belonging to a faction that opposed the founders of the world's order, in a conflict that predates the Void Century itself. Worn now by descendants who mostly have no idea they are wearing anything at all. But most importantly, it's a signature. It is the name history assigned to a specific kind of person, and it has been passed down by blood to people who mostly never learned what it meant. And yet every single confirmed bearer has ended up doing the same three things. They opposed the established order, whether deliberately or by consequence. They caused change too large for the world to absorb and reverse, and when death arrived, they met it with something other than fear. Whatever the D is, its bearers consistently meet the end with something other than terror. And this, more than any political consequence, is the detail Oda keeps returning to across 2 decades. If the wrath of a supposed god is coming for the children of disobedience, and the children of disobedience keep meeting it with something closer to a joke than a plea, the only reasonable conclusion is that they can see something the faithful can. The world government has a word for people like that, and Corazon told it to a dying child: the natural enemies of God. Ephesians has an older word for the same accusation: the children of disobedience, who walk according to the course of this world, who carry their rebellion rather than reasoning into it, and upon whom wrath is coming. That phrase fits the D exactly, but it has exactly one flaw, and one flaw only. The flaw being that there is no God on that throne. There is a hidden thing that can delete a country, and cannot delete a name, and an entire world has been calling it heaven because the only documents that could say otherwise were burned before anyone alive was born. 8 centuries, 1 signature, and the only people ever punished for disobedience in this story are the ones who correctly identified who they were being asked to obey. Well, in a section called the anomaly, you can probably guess what I'm going to be talking about. If the will of D represents opposition to the world government in the service of freedom, truth, or some version of the dawn, then Marshall D. Teach should not fit. His ambition is not to end the world's order, it is to own it. He wants to be the strongest, to hold the world in his hand, to sit where the winners sit. He murdered his own crewmate for a devil fruit. He turned in his brother in arms to buy a title from the government his bloodline was hunted by. Whitebeard on record dismissed Blackbeard's claim to be carrying anything Roger would recognize. So there might be a difference here between having the initial and having the will. There are 2 readings to this. Reading 1 being that a name, plus an inherited disposition that produces opposition to the established order as behavior, says nothing whatsoever about the moral content of what a D builds. Under this reading, Teach fits perfectly. He is exactly as much a natural enemy of God as Roger was. He simply chose conquest where Roger chose disclosure. The pattern was never a promise about outcomes. It was a description of temperament, and reading 2 being that the D carries an implicit direction toward Joy Boy's unfulfilled promise, towards something nearer liberation than replacement. Under this reading, Teach has the trait and has aimed it wrong, the exception that proves the rule by violating it. But I do believe that Oda has been making the case for reading 1. Imu described the D as a name belonging to a past faction, carried now by people ignorant of its meaning. That is a definition of ancestry, not of purpose. A name cannot enforce a moral direction on the person carrying it, and the moment you claim it can, you have smuggled the chosen one narrative back in through the window. The exact narrative chapter 1085 spent its page count dismantling. But I do not think the question is closed. If the D is purely nominal, then the consistency across 14 lives becomes harder to explain, not easier, and we will come back to that. So far I have been arguing that the D are only children of disobedience relative to a counterfeit god, that their refusal is legitimate because the authority is not. But what happens when one of them wants the throne? Because that is Teach's actual position. His ambition is not to end the counterfeit, it is to inherit it. He does not want the empty throne vacated. He wants to be the one sitting in it, with the same monopoly on force and the same silence underneath. And if he got there, the structure of the world would not change at all, only the name of the thing at the top. Refusing a false god is not a virtue in itself. It is only meaningful if you do not intend to become one. Disobedience is a negative condition. It tells you what someone will not accept, and nothing at all about what they would build. Blackbeard is a living question, whether the D's pattern was ever about freedom, or whether it has always just been about not being the one who obeys. Roger's answer and Teach's answer to that question are opposite, and the initial in their names is identical. So this leads us to the major question. If the D is nothing but a name, why does Imu flinch when it hears one? Either the name carries something real, a trait, an inheritance, or Imu is afraid of the history rather than the biology. The D is the label attached to the last people who nearly won, and every time it resurfaces, it is evidence that the erasure is incomplete, that the stones are still out there, and that the world's official story is one successful broadcast away from collapsing. Imu's fear tracks information with remarkable precision. Poneglyphs, scholars, Ohara, the Reverie, Egghead, a letter left 800 years ago. Everything it hunts is a record. That is a regime frightened of an archive, not a god frightened of a bloodline. Dawn, divine, death, maybe a half moon. There are countless, even endless theories of what the D actually stands for. Dawn being tied to Joy Boy's promised return and the language of a new era, and it has a genuine textual furniture around it. Lily's letter, which instructed the D to bear the flag of Dawn. Luffy's home is Dawn Island. The first arc is Romance Dawn. That is a lot of thematic weight in one direction. So is the Will of D a destiny, or a name that has, so far, only ever landed on people who chose defiance? Imu's own words tip the scale. The bearers are described as ignorant of the meaning of what they carry. And that is an extraordinarily strange detail to include if the D mechanically compelled behavior. If the name were a destiny, ignorance would not matter. Destiny does not require informed consent. Instead, the story goes out of its way to tell us that most of these people had no idea, which only carries weight if their actions were their own. Look at what that reframes. Law's entire arc is a man doing exactly what a D does without knowing there is such a thing. Garp spent 50 years inside the institution that hunts his own name and still declined at every decisive moment. Not because a bloodline made him, but because he kept looking at what he was being asked to do and deciding no. Saul had a direct order from the closest thing this world has to heaven, and he waited against a crying 6-year-old, and heaven lost. None of that is compulsion. All of it is judgment. So the more compelling reading is that the D is the name history gave to a specific kind of person. The kind who, on encountering the world's cruelty directly, refuses to accept it as permanent. The will is not a supernatural force acting on anyone. It is the accumulated historical fact that people carrying this inherited name have, generation after generation, turned out to be that kind of person far more often than chance predicts, and that the world's rulers noticed the correlation long before the readers did, and built an extermination program around it. So if someone put me in a room with the 5 elders and made me choose one sentence to explain the Ds, I'd say this: the Ds are not disobedient, they are unconvinced. Disobedience requires a legitimate authority to disobey. What these people have in common across 800 years is not defiance of the world's order. It is that not one of them ever accepted its premise. Roger checked the premise against the primary sources and laughed. Lily checked it and scattered the evidence. Clover checked it and could not accept a world where a name is a capital crime. Luffy has never checked it, because it has never occurred to him that there was anything there to check. 14 confirmed names, 8 centuries, and every faction the story has built. Pirates and kings, a marine hero, a revolutionary, a scholar, a giant, a princess. Some of them changed the world deliberately. Some never learned what they were carrying until it killed them. One of them is currently trying to turn the whole pattern into something it was never shaped for. And the oldest, most powerful institution in the world has been watching every one of them, keeping records, executing children, waiting to find out which of them would finish what the first one apparently started. I think the literal meaning of the letter will end up mattering less than what the pattern has already demonstrated. Whether it stands for dawn or death or a stolen title, the record is on the page. It is the name history gave to the people who looked at the world as it was, and decided, individually, repeatedly, across generations who mostly never met and mostly never knew what they shared, that it did not have to stay that way. And that is where the borrowed verse finally has to be handed back. Ephesians condemns the children of disobedience because they walk according to the course of this world, and because the ruler they follow is not God but the prince of the power of the air, a usurper mistaken for the highest authority by everyone who never got to check. For 800 years that charge has been aimed at the D-Clan, by an institution that calls its own bloodline heavenly, its own enforcers warrior gods, its own capital the Holy Land, and its own artillery divine wrath. Read the verse again with the world government in it. Every element fits, and none of them fit the people on the ships. It was never a description of the D. It was a description of Mary Joieuse, and of the things sitting in the one chair nobody was supposed to fill. Imu called them empty husks, but I would argue they are the fullest people in the story. And for a reason that has nothing to do with bloodlines. They are the only ones who never let the world convince them that its current shape was permanent.